We have the opportunity to talk to two think tank experts. To the right of me, I have my colleague here, Jamie Fly, who is a senior fellow and senior advisor to the president working out of our Berlin office at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where he researches and speaks about transatlantic relations. Jamie previously served as president and chief executive officer of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague, and he was also a senior staffer for Senator Marco Rubio from Florida. Thanks, Jamie, for being here with us today. And I think pretty soon I'm going to see Michael Werz appear on a screen.
I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Good to see you, Michael. Michael is a senior fellow at the MacArthur Foundation based in Germany from 2020 to 2021. And so currently, and he's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where his work as a member of the national security team focuses on climate change, migration, and security and emerging democracies. He's also a senior transatlantic fellow at GMF. So great to have you both with us. We just learned, obviously, during the last conversation with Congressman Dent and Congressman Carnahan, things are still early. We don't know what's going to happen yet, but we do know that it's going to be close. It's not going to be a landslide for either candidate. So maybe I'll start off with a question about the polls. Are people just going to ignore the polls next time around? Why don't I start with you, Jamie, and then we'll go to Michael.
Sure. Yeah, I think certainly on the Republican side, there was already a lot of skepticism going into tonight about the polling, given what happened 4 years ago. And you had a few conservative pollsters who were predicting something more like this outcome for Donald Trump, a last-minute surge in support of Trump. And so I think you might see even more polarization when it comes to the polls going forward, where conservatives, Republicans aren't going to trust the polls. They think that they're part of a media establishment which is biased against the Republican Party. And after what we've seen, at least in some of the states, I mean, in Florida, for instance, Donald Trump defied the polls, clearly did much better than the polling showed. We'll see in the closer states in the Rust Belt whether there are similar trends. There's something there about Donald Trump, the candidate, which the polls don't seem to pick up. And it's just unclear if it's some of his demographic is not being reached by the pollsters' methods, or if it's maybe about him personally and whether people are willing to be frank with pollsters about their real views about Donald Trump as a candidate.
Michael, maybe you can comment on that. And as well, since you are studying, specific voter groups like Hispanics in the United States, I mean, do you still think that so-called demographic shift hasn't crested to the point where it's going to give, solid wins to the Democrats?
Look, thank you for having me, first of all. And I agree with Jamie that the polling organizations really need to do a deep dive into their methodology, because we were told before this election that they had larger sample sizes in the swing states, which was obviously a problem in 2016, that their polling was much better adjusted for education, or rather the lack thereof when it comes to low information voters, and that they also used a lot of online panels in combination with personal interviews just to give people that might not be forthcoming with their support with Donald Trump an opportunity to voice their opinion more clearly. And so all of that obviously hasn't worked out. We'll see. I mean, the results are still out, but I think the polling was misleading once again, and I think that is really something that is questioning an entire business model that has influenced politics in the United States for at least the last 30 to 40 years. When it comes to Latinos or Hispanics, yes, of course, that demographic shift is still happening. There are about 3 million new Latino voters every electoral presidential cycle, every 4 years. You could tell from voter mobilization and also participation vote. Latinos are traditionally not very good at voting. It has to do with education, with obligations to work all day on Tuesday or during an election day, and also with the complications of registering to vote. But it is certainly a growing powerhouse. The only exception, I would say, is Florida, because the Latino community in Florida is much more diverse, much more complex, and was also subject to a massive disinformation campaign by the Trump campaign to outside interference from Colombian conservative parties that have kind of openly lobbied and and canvassed for Donald Trump among the Latino community, especially the Colombians and the Venezuelans in Miami. So there's a lot of stuff to discuss. There's not an easy answer, but I think the big takeaway of this election is how do we think about people increasingly making decisions either based on false or manipulative information.
So actually, since you brought that up, Michael, I'm actually going to talk to Jamie about that, because what do you think about how the media performed this cycle? I mean, obviously, we're still in the thick of things with coverage of this election, but leading up until this point, and the whole question about disinformation, were we better prepared this cycle than in 2016?
I think certainly we were better prepared than last time. There were a lot of lessons learned after 2016. Some of those were started to be refined in 2018 with the midterms. I think the federal government has done much more in terms of the relevant law enforcement and intelligence agencies, setting in place crisis centers to monitor disinformation. We've seen some reports even tonight about some proactive offensive cyber campaigns that the US may have conducted against actors like Iran in recent weeks who were trying to interfere in the elections. We'll find out maybe in the coming months whether something similar was done vis-a-vis Russia. I think the big problem that still exists, the vulnerability, comes when you look at just whether the populace understands that they are the target of these campaigns and whether they're educated about how to deal with them. The government, the tech companies have all made strides, but I'm not sure that we've reached that saturation level amongst the general public where people, when they're making decisions about who they're going to support and looking at information online, are really thinking about who is behind this piece of information, what is their agenda. That sort of literacy is really not widespread, I think, amongst the American electorate yet.
Michael, tell us a little bit about where you think the Democratic Party is right now. I mean, Joe Biden has been really the comeback kid, because nobody really thought he had a standing chance until he arrived again on the scene in March during the primary in South Carolina. And he's clearly a moderate figure, as is Kamala Harris. If he wins and if Congress does go to the Democrats, will there be pressure from the progressive side of the party to do more? And if he does lose, do you think that the Democrats are going to change their ground game?
With regard to the latter question, let's discuss that when we have the results. I don't know that will be a speculation, but I think Joe Biden has already committed to a number of the more progressive goals in the party platform, and they have integrated a bunch of people from the Buttigieg, but also from the Warren and Sanders campaigns in writing this 100-page document. And Joe Biden knows that this is the future of the party, and I think especially for our European friends, it's always important to emphasize that in a European context, the shift that we have seen within the Democratic Party over the last half decade or so is a shift from what in Europe would be a center-right party under Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, with fiscal, social, and other policies, to a social liberal, not even a social democratic party, European style. So all the notions that people try to claim that Joe Biden now is a socialist, especially in a country where socialist movements never really existed, and the people that talk about them obviously don't know what they're talking about, is somewhat ironic. I think it is an important modernization for the Democratic Party, because we need to build something that it has a semblance to what in Europe, and especially in Germany and Austria and other central Western European countries, is a form of an economy that puts a greater premium on social responsibility, social cohesion, and solidarity. Because we clearly see that the model that we're using here in the United States is outdated, leaves a lot of people behind, and ultimately is not productive for the well-being of society at large.
So let's take a look at the GOP. We have Jamie here, a Republican, a rare breed in this country, hard to find one. What do you think about the GOP? I mean, it looks like Trumpism is here to stay, whether if he wins or loses, because the election looks so close at the moment. What is this party going to look like moving forward?
I think a lot of that will still depend on ultimately whether he wins or loses. He clearly has overperformed expectations tonight. So I do think that there's going to be a strong element of the party that will continue to represent what Trump stands for, the sort of Trumpism. And you've seen conventional politicians, even in the final days in some of the key states, I think, seeing that trend, and maybe if they were silent in the weeks prior, suddenly kind of showing up and showing their support for the president and his reelection. And so, yeah, I think this is probably going to be Trump's party for some time to come. The other factor is just because of Donald Trump and who he is, even if he does lose, and especially given now how, if it looks like he loses, if he's going to lose, it's going to be close. He's going to want to remain engaged, and even if he's on the sidelines, he'll be very active in the media. The media love, despite the fact that I think the media tends to not support Donald Trump, they love him. He's good for ratings. I think that trend is going to continue even if he's out of the White House. And the key question, though, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Senate. And that's where Republicans have also thus far, I think, exceeded expectations. The Senate has had a kind of love-hate relationship with this president. They've disagreed with him on a number of policy issues. It's been very rare when they're really willing to stand up to the president. I think there are going to be interesting things happening in the Senate if Republicans maintain control, either if Donald Trump wins a second term, but especially if Biden wins the White House, because that's where you're going to start to have a genesis of, I think, what the post-Trump party looks like, and they're going to be able to figure out where they cooperate with the Biden administration and where they oppose the Biden administration.
Michael, since we have you, a German based in Washington, D.C., tell our audience a little bit about what you think a Joe Biden administration would mean for the transatlantic relationship. There's a feeling here that, sure, the tone might get better, but, it may not, in terms of content, change all that much. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. If you allow me 1 minute and 15 seconds on what Jamie just said, and I'm trying not to sound too partisan here, but I think what we have to recognize here in the United States, that with a president that is a pathological liar, that cannot speak the truth because he just can't do it, and a party, or at least an electorate behind him, that seemed to have inverted the Cartesian credo into "I don't think, therefore I am," and where many middle-class Americans that are prosperous and safe have become virtual immigrants, and they've emigrated outside the constitutional and democratic traditions that have coined policies and politics in this country for over 2 centuries, is a reason for massive concern. Because in the United States, because of the size of our society and because of its heterogeneity, the public sphere is a very fragile but extremely important instrument to neutralize differences and figure out ways of cooperation and living together. And I just want to put this out there because I think we are really at a threshold moment, and that requires like the engagement of everybody to figure out how we can repair the damage that has been done over the last 4 years, independent of the outcome of the election. With regard to Joe Biden, I think from what you can hear if you talk to his closest advisors, he's very cognizant that there is absolutely no way to go back to the status quo ante of the 1990s. And that's good, especially for a dude that's almost 80 years old. He talks about himself as being a bridge between the generations. I don't exactly know what that means, but it seems to be an indicator that he is willing to leave the space for a new generation, new thinkers, and people that understand that the reputational damage that we have suffered across the world has been undermining one of America's most important tools, immaterial tools of global power, namely convincing other governments to do us favors, to stand with us, and to support us when we try to shape outcomes in a global environment. And that needs to be rebuilt, and that will be a very, very difficult task. It seems that Joe Biden is willing to do all the symbolic things, from the climate agreement to going to the Munich Security Conference and hugging the Europeans and the Taiwanese and the South Koreans and the Japanese, but that won't be enough. And my feeling is that at least the crew that is surrounding him knows this, is very cognizant of the challenges, and will try to address them. Whether they will have the bandwidth to do this with the tremendous domestic challenges that we are facing, that's an entirely different question. It will depend on whether the Europeans are forward-leaning and aggressive in trying to look for a conversation with the new American administration, should there be one. Because my feeling is that Germany, Brussels, and a bunch of Western European countries have more influence and more leverage in helping to shape the global positioning in the United States when it comes especially to multilateral affairs more intensely and more effectively than ever before since the end of the Second World War. It's a huge opportunity, but it requires to think about the world through the eyes of the United States, and that always has been a challenge in Europe.
Jamie, what do you think if President Trump gets reelected? Is it sort of still kind of unknown? Should the Europeans be more assertive, or should they continue to sort of hedge and hang back? What would you recommend to European partners?
Yeah, actually, I agree with Michael's assessment. I think that it's going to be important, irrespective of the outcome, for Europe to figure out for itself how it can be competitive in this emerging geopolitical landscape. I think it's going to be more of an acute, immediate concern if Donald Trump is reelected, because my sense is that Donald Trump and his administration will double down on a lot of their approaches to the world. I think when it comes to personnel, you may see some even more extreme versions of the types of people that he's appointed over the last 4 years. You know, we're well past the sort of wise men phase of this administration, and I think you know, some of the interlocutors that the Europeans have used over the last 4 years will probably move on. And so, I think irrespective of the outcome, Germany in particular needs to decide whether it's going to work, especially on defense with the French, whether Germany wants to kind of lead in its own more transatlanticist approach. I think there's some fundamental questions for the Europeans that are going to be incredibly urgent if Donald Trump wins re-election, but are also important if Biden wins, because as we've seen tonight, America is divided. And although most Americans aren't voting based on foreign policy, certainly Trump supporters are not rejecting his foreign policy. And there are a lot of strains of his foreign policy, his trade policy, that I think actually excite a lot of his electorate. And in a number of these states, he's actually improved over his performance 4 years ago, which is quite striking given what the country has been through over the last 9 months with the pandemic. And so I think all of these results that are trickling in should lead to some real soul searching amongst America's European allies about what role Europe will play and whether Europe is willing to take on more responsibility for itself, given a lot of the trends that we're seeing in the US.
And Jamie, I'd like to also give you the opportunity to comment on what Michael talked about in terms of the strength of democracy in the United States and, you know, the values that undergird our Constitution. I mean, a lot of Europeans ask about the health of democracy in the United States. And in a previous life, you were my colleague at GMF, also head of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. What do you tell our European partners when they ask you about the state of American democracy?
Well, I think that's the most concerning thing for me, given where we're going with the results tonight, is honestly, this is the worst case scenario for those of us who have been concerned about a close election that may take days, perhaps weeks, if there's legal action involved, to get resolved, is given the ongoing conflicts in American society, the upheaval we've seen in recent months, and the energy on both sides, whether we can endure this period and let the institutions work. Donald Trump, who's speaking right now, has not already, I think, tried to pour fuel on the fire tonight over Twitter. We'll see what he says. I don't have a lot of confidence in his ability to kind of tamp down these tensions, but I think it's going to be incredibly important for Democrats and Republicans in Congress to speak out and just remind Americans that we need to let the votes be counted and let the process work. And we've had contested elections before, 2000 in Florida, which is not pretty, but there's a process for these things, even if the courts do need to get involved. But this comes at a difficult time, just given the tensions on both sides. And so, yeah, I think the next few days and potentially the next several weeks could be incredibly consequential. I still have faith in the process and in our state officials who are overseeing these processes, and also in the courts. And so I think both Biden and Trump supporters just need to allow that process to play out.
So last question to Michael Werz in Washington, D.C. What's your feeling? What should Europeans be watching for these next couple of days? And it may be still too early, but who do you think, which are the voting groups that are going to be called sort of the significant game changers for this year's election? We've talked about soccer moms, hockey moms, I think Joe the plumber in the past as well. Who are you looking for as you look at the results of this election?
Right. That is, I think that's still too early to tell. We need the micro data from the exit polls, and also a better understanding of who voted for whom during the massive mail-in ballots that we've seen in this electoral cycle, because we are in a unique situation that so few people voted in person that the exit polls are not as meaningful as they usually are, and they've been usually good instruments to answer the questions that you were arising. I think from a European perspective, I would respond in more general terms. My feeling is that especially in the transatlantic environment, which has for a number of decades been dominated by a relatively small group in Europe and by a relatively small group in the United States, mostly from the Harvard-Foggy Bottom corridor and very much centered around New England and a few hundred miles south of it, all the way to Washington. That needs to be completely rethought, because my feeling is that many Europeans don't fully grasp the massive demographic and cultural transformation that the United States is undergoing, the relevance of the Western states in the Southwest, the demographic shift. If you look at the census data over the last 20 years, the mathematical center of population in the United States moves away from Europe 5 meters every day. So we are physically moving away from Europe into a more Pacific arena. And I think that needs to be represented in terms of experiences, in terms of regional specificities, and also in terms of interlocutors in transatlantic relations. So we are ourselves about a good 2 decades behind those developments. And that is also to a certain degree true for a younger generation in Europe, because we always forget here in the United States that everybody younger than 30 or 35 in Europe only knows the United States post-Iraq and Afghanistan invasion. And for those younger people, the United States is Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, targeted killings, NSA, and so on and so forth. A very different picture of the US than their parents might have had. And so I think on both sides, we need to figure out a way to establish something like Transatlantic 2.0 that requires new lifeblood, new generations, but also a bunch of new ideas.
Thank you so much, Michael, for staying up late with us. Thank you, Jamie, for getting up early. And we're going to take a quick short break before we get to Ambassador John Emerson out of California.